In Willowbrook, Ohio, a 72-year-old grandmother was about to discover that the children she'd sacrificed everything for had planned the cruelest Christmas betrayal imaginable. What started as preparing a festive holiday dinner for 12 family members turned into the loneliest night of Margaret Johnson's life, and by midnight, she would make a decision that would change everything forever. For 30 years, I had been the glue holding our family together, the one who remembered every birthday, organized every holiday, and opened my home and heart to children who had grown comfortable taking my love for granted. But this Christmas Eve, when I sat alone at a table set for 12, surrounded by cooling food that no one came to eat, I finally understood that being a devoted mother doesn't guarantee devoted children. What my 3 children didn't know was that their absence would cost them more than just my broken heart. It would cost them their entire inheritance, and by morning they would wake up to discover that love, unlike blood, is something that must be earned every single day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. The Setup and Betrayal. My name is Margaret Johnson, but everyone in Willowbrook calls me Maggie. At 72, I've lived in the same yellow Victorian house on Maple Street for 45 years, the house where I raised my 3 children after my husband Frank passed away when they were just teenagers. The morning light streaming through my kitchen window on December 23rd illuminated the same worn countertops where I'd prepared thousands of meals, helped with countless homework assignments, and bandaged scraped knees from bicycle accidents that seemed like yesterday but were actually decades ago. I had been planning this Christmas for months. Not just planning it, but orchestrating it with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that comes from being a woman who understands that family traditions don't maintain themselves. They require intention, effort, and someone who cares enough to make magic happen year after year. That someone had always been me, and despite the warning signs I'd been ignoring for too long, I believed this Christmas would be different. This Christmas, my adult children would finally appreciate what I'd been trying to give them all these years. The guest list was written in my careful handwriting on the notepad that lived permanently beside my landline telephone. Robert, my oldest at 51, would bring his wife Jennifer and their twin daughters, Emma and Grace, now 16 and convinced they were too sophisticated for grandmother's old-fashioned Christmas traditions. Susan, my middle child at 48, had promised to arrive with her husband Michael and their son Tyler, 22 and fresh out of college, with ideas about how the world should work that made family dinners challenging. David, my youngest at 45, would come with his new girlfriend Amanda, a woman I'd met exactly twice, but was determined to welcome with the same warmth I'd always shown my children's romantic partners, regardless of how temporary they might prove to be. 12 people total, which meant I'd been shopping and cooking for 3 days straight. My arthritis had been acting up something fierce, making the heavy lifting and constant stirring more difficult than it used to be. But I'd learned long ago that physical discomfort was a small price to pay for the joy of bringing my family together. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself as I moved slowly through my kitchen, checking the turkey that had been roasting since dawn and stirring the gravy that Frank used to say was better than his mother's. The dining room table had been set since December 20th, extended to its full length, with the leaf that required 2 people to install, but which I'd managed to wrestle into place by myself. The good china that had been my mother's wedding gift gleamed under the chandelier that Frank had installed when the children were small, each place setting arranged with the precision of a woman who believed that beauty mattered, that effort mattered, that showing love through careful attention to detail was never wasted energy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd spent the entire previous week cleaning the house from top to bottom, washing guest linens, and stocking the guest bathroom with the expensive hand towels that my children had given me last Christmas, but which I usually saved for special occasions. This was a special occasion, or so I believed. This was Christmas with the family I'd devoted my entire adult life to building and maintaining and loving, even when that love felt increasingly one-sided. The warning signs had been accumulating for months, but I'd developed a talent for explaining them away that would have impressed a professional diplomat. When Robert had been late to my birthday dinner in September, arriving 2 hours after everyone else had finished eating, he'd blamed work deadlines and promised to do better next time. When Susan had forgotten to call me back after I'd left 3 messages about Thanksgiving plans, she'd claimed her phone had been broken, and she'd been meaning to get a new one. When David had shown up to our traditional Halloween candy-sharing ritual without costumes for himself and Amanda, explaining that they'd been too busy with apartment hunting to prepare, I'd simply handed out candy to trick-or-treaters, while wearing the witch costume I'd hoped we'd all enjoy together. Each incident, viewed in isolation, could be explained away by the busy lives that modern adults lead. But together they formed a pattern that I was finally beginning to recognize, even if I wasn't ready to acknowledge what it meant. My children had grown comfortable with my unconditional love and unlimited forgiveness. They'd learned that no matter how thoughtlessly they treated me, I would always welcome them back with open arms and a fully prepared meal. The phone rang at 11:30 on Christmas Eve morning while I was basting the turkey for the 3rd time. Robert's voice carried that particular tone of regret that I'd learned to recognize over the years, the sound of someone delivering disappointing news while hoping to minimize its impact. "Mom, I'm really sorry, but Jennifer's been feeling terrible all morning. I think it might be food poisoning from the restaurant we went to last night. She's been throwing up for hours, and the girls are worried they might be getting sick too. We're gonna have to skip Christmas dinner this year." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, still wearing the oven mitts that were decorated with dancing reindeer, feeling something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the December weather. "Oh honey, I'm so sorry Jennifer isn't feeling well. Could I bring some soup over? Or maybe just the girls could come? They'd be safe here if they're not sick yet." The pause that followed lasted long enough for me to hear the television in the background, playing what sounded like a football game. Not the desperate quiet of a house dealing with illness, but the comfortable noise of people settled in for a relaxing day at home. "That's really sweet of you, Mom, but I think it's better if we all just stay put today. You understand, right? Maybe we can get together next weekend when everyone's feeling better." I understood more than Robert realized, but I wasn't ready to say so. Not yet. "Of course, honey. Tell Jennifer I hope she feels better soon. I love you." "Love you too, Mom. Thanks for understanding." The line went dead, and I stood there for a full minute before carefully hanging up the receiver and returning to my turkey. 1 family down, 2 to go. Surely Susan and David would still come. Surely I wouldn't be spending Christmas alone after months of preparation. The call from Susan came 20 minutes later, just as I was pulling the green bean casserole from the oven. Her voice carried the breathless quality of someone who'd been rushing around, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded almost like relief. "Mom, Michael's mother had a fall this morning. She's okay, but she's pretty shaken up, and we need to drive to Columbus to check on her. The doctor says it's not serious, but you know how these things are. We can't really leave her alone on Christmas." Michael's mother, Dorothy, was a woman I'd met at Susan's wedding 24 years ago and perhaps a dozen times since. A perfectly nice woman who lived in a retirement community with round-the-clock medical staff, and 3 other children who lived within 30 minutes of her facility. But I didn't point any of that out to Susan, because I was beginning to understand that the details of these excuses weren't really the point. "Is there anything I can do to help? I could pack up some food for you to take to her, or..." "That's so thoughtful, Mom, but we're leaving in about an hour, and we'll probably just grab something on the road. You know how much I hate to miss Christmas dinner? Maybe we can do something special for New Year's instead? Another holiday to plan, another opportunity for disappointment." But I heard myself saying, "Of course, sweetheart. Give Dorothy my best wishes for a quick recovery." "Thanks, Mom. You're the best. Love you." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone in my kitchen with enough food to feed 12 people and a growing certainty that David's call would be coming soon. I didn't have to wait long. David's voice, when it came 30 minutes later, carried a different quality than his siblings. Where Robert had sounded apologetic and Susan had sounded rushed, David just sounded tired. Tired in a way that suggested he'd been dreading this conversation all morning. "Hey, Mom, listen, I need to talk to you about today. Amanda's parents are in town for Christmas, and they've invited us to join them for dinner at that new steakhouse downtown. I know we planned to come to your place, But this is the first time I'm meeting her parents, and it feels really important for our relationship, you know? I knew. I knew that my youngest son, the one I'd worried about most because he'd always been sensitive and thoughtful, was choosing his girlfriend's parents over his own mother on Christmas Day. I knew that the relationship he'd described as casual just a few months ago had apparently become serious enough to warrant abandoning family traditions. I knew that the careful planning and preparation I'd done for months meant less to him than making a good impression on people he'd never mentioned until today. I understand, David. Meeting the parents is important. My voice sounded steady, even to my own ears, which surprised me because everything inside my chest felt like it was crumbling. Maybe you could stop by later for dessert? I made your favorite apple pie. We might be able to swing by later, depending on how the day goes. Thanks for being so understanding, Mom. You always are. Yes, I thought as I hung up the phone. I always am. And maybe that's been the problem all along. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of love that nobody wanted. The turkey was perfectly golden, the stuffing fragrant with sage and onions, the cranberry sauce molded into the glass dish that had been Frank's grandmother's. The rolls were rising under a clean kitchen towel, the sweet potatoes were bubbling in their brown sugar glaze, and the apple pie cooling on the counter still smelled like cinnamon and home. For 45 years, I had been the center around which my family's celebrations revolved. I had been the one who remembered traditions, who insisted on gathering everyone together, who believed that family dinners and holiday rituals mattered enough to sacrifice time and energy, and sometimes my own desires to make them happen. I had been the keeper of birthdays and anniversaries, the one who sent care packages to college students and graduation gifts to grandchildren who were too busy to call. But standing there in my kitchen at 1 o'clock on Christmas Eve, surrounded by enough food for a small army and facing the prospect of eating it alone, I finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. My children had learned to take my love for granted, because I had taught them that they could. I had made my affection so unconditional, my forgiveness so automatic, my presence so reliable that they'd stopped seeing me as a person with feelings and needs and expectations of my own. I was simply Mom, the woman who would always be there, who would always understand, who would always make everything easy for them, while expecting nothing in return except the privilege of continuing to serve them. I had trained them to treat me as optional, and they had learned that lesson perfectly. The house felt enormous around me as I moved slowly from room to room, looking at the decorations I'd hung with such hope just a week ago. The Christmas tree in the living room twinkled with lights that Frank and I had strung together decades ago, ornaments that told the story of our family's life together. Baby shoes bronzed and dated, school photos in handmade frames, vacation souvenirs that had seemed important enough to commemorate permanently. Each ornament was a memory, and each memory was a reminder of how much love I'd poured into children who had grown up to see that love as an inexhaustible resource, rather than a precious gift. I had given them everything I had to give, and they had learned to expect it as their natural due rather than appreciate it as the choice it had always been. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 o'clock, and I realized I needed to make a decision about dinner. I could pack everything away, pretend this Christmas had never happened, and try to salvage something from the wreckage of my expectations. Or I could sit down at that carefully set table and eat the meal I'd prepared with such love, even if I was eating it alone. I chose to sit down. Not because I was hungry. My appetite had disappeared along with my family, but because someone needed to acknowledge the effort that had gone into this day. Someone needed to appreciate the time and care and love that had been invested in this meal, even if that someone was only me. I filled one plate with small portions of everything I'd prepared and carried it to my place at the head of the table. The silence in the dining room was profound, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. I said grace over my solitary meal, thanking God for the food and asking for the wisdom to know what to do with the knowledge that was crystallizing in my heart with each passing moment. My children didn't love me the way I loved them. They didn't value me the way I valued them. They didn't prioritize me the way I had always prioritized them. And perhaps most painfully, they didn't need me the way I had spent decades needing to be needed by them. As I ate my Christmas dinner alone, tasting the flavors that had taken days to perfect, and feeling each bite turn to ash in my mouth, I began to understand that love given without boundaries becomes love that is taken for granted. Kindness offered without limits becomes kindness that is expected rather than appreciated. And sacrifice made without recognition becomes sacrifice that is invisible to the people it's meant to serve. The evenings stretched ahead of me like an Arctic wasteland. I could call friends, but most of them were spending Christmas with their own families. I could watch television, but every channel would be full of heartwarming stories about families gathering together for the holidays. I could read, but even my favorite novels couldn't compete with the echo of my own thoughts in the too quiet house. Instead, I found myself sitting in Frank's old recliner in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree, and thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment. Every decision I'd made as a mother had been motivated by love, but somewhere along the way, that love had become enabling rather than nurturing. I had made my children's lives so comfortable that they'd never learned to value comfort. I had solved their problems so consistently that they'd never learned to appreciate solutions. The phone rang 3 times that evening. The first call was from my neighbor Betty, checking to make sure I was okay because she hadn't seen any cars in my driveway all day. The second was from Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church, making his traditional Christmas Eve calls to elderly parishioners. The third was a wrong number, someone looking for a pizza place that apparently had a number similar to mine. Not one of my children called to check on me. Not one of them seemed to wonder how I was spending Christmas alone after planning for months to spend it with them. Not one of them appeared to consider that their absence might have hurt me, or that their casual dismissal of my efforts might have consequences beyond the inconvenience of a wasted meal. By 10 o'clock, I had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 12 hours earlier. I was going to change my will, and I was going to do it tonight. Not in anger, though I was certainly angry. Not for revenge, though there was definitely an element of justice in what I was planning. But because I had finally understood that love without consequences is love that teaches nothing, and it was time for my children to learn some lessons they should have absorbed decades ago. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom slowly, my arthritis reminding me with each step that I was no longer the young mother who had once carried sleeping children up these same stairs. In my bedroom closet, behind the winter coats that smelled like mothballs and memories, I kept the fireproof box that contained all my important documents: birth certificates, marriage license, Frank's death certificate, insurance policies, and the will that currently left everything I owned divided equally among my 3 children. The will that was about to change forever. As I sat on my bed with the document in my hands, reading through provisions that had seemed so fair and loving when I'd written them 5 years ago, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, that had happened earlier, over Christmas dinner eaten in silence. This was something else. This was my heart reforming itself around a new understanding of what love actually meant. Love wasn't giving everything and expecting nothing. Love wasn't making life so easy for people that they never learned to struggle or appreciate or grow. Love wasn't sacrificing yourself so completely that you became invisible to the people you were sacrificing for. Real love, I was beginning to understand, included accountability. Real love sometimes said no. Real love required that the people receiving it demonstrate that they valued it enough to reciprocate it, or at least to acknowledge it, or at the very minimum to show up when they said they would. The clock in my bedroom showed 11:47 p.m. when I picked up the phone to call Robert Henderson, the attorney who had handled Frank's estate and who had prepared my current will. I knew he would be asleep, knew I would be waking him on Christmas Eve, knew this call would seem completely unreasonable to anyone who didn't understand what I had endured today. But I also knew that some decisions can't wait for business hours, and some lessons can't be postponed until it's convenient to teach them. My children had spent decades learning to take my love for granted. Tonight, they were going to begin learning what it felt like to lose it. The phone rang 4 times before Robert's sleepy voice answered. Henderson Residence. Robert, this is Maggie Johnson. I'm terribly sorry to call so late, but I need to change my will tonight, and I need your help to do it properly. There was a long pause, and I could hear him becoming more alert as he processed my request. Maggie, are you all right? Has something happened? Something has happened, I said, my voice steady with a certainty that surprised me. I've finally understood what my children think of me, and I've decided it's time they understood what I think of that. This is Christmas Eve, Maggie. Maybe we should wait until after the holidays to discuss any major changes. Sometimes family gatherings can bring up emotions that— Robert, I interrupted, there was no family gathering. That's exactly the point. I spent 3 days cooking for 12 people, and not one of my children bothered to show up. Not one of them called to check on me afterward. Not one of them seems to understand that their actions have consequences. Another pause, longer this time. When Robert spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone of a lawyer who had spent decades helping people navigate the intersection of family relationships and legal documents. What kind of changes are you thinking about, Maggie? I looked around my bedroom at the photos on my dresser showing birthday parties and graduations and family vacations, at the hope chest at the foot of my bed where I still kept baby clothes and school artwork that my grown children had probably forgotten they'd ever made. This room held 45 years of memories, 45 years of love given freely and completely. It was time to give something else. It was time to give consequences. I want to leave everything to charity, Robert. Every penny, every possession, every single thing that my children have been assuming would someday be theirs. I want to leave it all to organizations that help people who actually appreciate help when they receive it. The silence that followed stretched so long that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was very careful. Maggie, I understand you're upset about today, but this is a very significant decision. Are you certain you want to make such dramatic changes based on one disappointing holiday? It's not based on one disappointing holiday, Robert. It's based on 30 years of disappointments that I've been making excuses for. It's based on finally understanding that I raise children who see me as a convenience rather than a person. It's based on the realization that the biggest disservice I ever did them was teaching them that love comes without conditions or consequences. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that had begun falling while I ate my solitary Christmas dinner. The street was empty, except for the warm glow of house lights where other families were probably finishing their own holiday celebrations. Families who had chosen to be together, who had prioritized each other, who understood that love was something to be cherished rather than taken for granted. I'm 72 years old, Robert. I don't have forever to teach my children the lessons they should have learned decades ago. But I do have this one chance to show them that choices have consequences, that love has limits, and that taking someone for granted is the surest way to lose them. My voice was growing stronger with each word, powered by a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Can you help me do this tonight, or do I need to find another attorney? I can help you, Robert said quietly, but I want you to promise me one thing, Maggie. I want you to promise that you'll sleep on this decision and call me tomorrow to confirm that you still want to proceed. If you do, I'll have the new will ready for you to sign by December 26th. I considered his request, understanding the wisdom in it, while also understanding that some decisions don't require additional consideration once you've seen the truth clearly enough. But Robert was a good man who had served my family well for many years, and if sleeping on it would make him more comfortable helping me, I could grant him that small courtesy. I promise to call you tomorrow, Robert, but I can tell you right now that my decision won't change. My children made their choice today when they decided that everything else in their lives was more important than showing up for their mother on Christmas. Now I'm making mine. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the darkness of my bedroom and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. Not vengeful or bitter, but powerful in the way that comes from finally understanding your own worth and demanding that others recognize it too. Tomorrow, my children would wake up expecting the world to continue exactly as it always had. They would expect that their mother would be available for the next holiday they decided to attend, ready with open arms and a perfectly prepared meal, and unlimited forgiveness for whatever thoughtlessness they chose to display. They would expect that their inheritance would remain secure, waiting for them whenever they decided they needed it, just like my love had always been waiting for them whenever they decided they wanted it. But tomorrow, their world was going to start changing in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And by the time they understood what they had lost, it would be too late to win it back. As midnight struck on Christmas Day, I was already planning the letters I would write to the charities that would benefit from my children's Christmas betrayal. Organizations that helped elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. programs that provided holiday meals for people who had nowhere else to go, causes that supported the kind of people my children might become if they ever learned to think of someone other than themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children's selfishness was about to help a lot of selfless people. Their inability to show up for me was about to make it possible for countless other people to show up for each other. And for the first time in decades, I fell asleep on Christmas night, feeling not like a mother whose love had been rejected, but like a woman whose choices mattered, and whose decisions would have consequences that extended far beyond the walls of her own disappointment. The change had begun, and there would be no going back. The morning of December 26th arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes your bones ache, and your breath visible in small white puffs. I woke up in my empty house feeling different than I had in years, as if something fundamental had shifted during the night. The Christmas decorations that had seemed so hopeful just days ago now looked like evidence of my own foolishness, but instead of the crushing sadness I expected to feel, I found myself filled with a strange sense of purpose. I made coffee in the kitchen that still held the lingering aroma of yesterday's untouched feast, and sat at my small breakfast table with Frank's old leather journal in my hands. After he died, I'd taken to writing in it occasionally, recording thoughts and observations that seemed too private for regular conversation but too important to forget entirely. This morning I felt compelled to document what had happened yesterday, not just the events themselves but the clarity they had brought me. As I wrote about Robert's unconvincing excuse about Jennifer's sudden illness, about Susan's dramatic rush to help Michael's mother who had 3 other children living nearby, about David's last-minute decision to prioritize his girlfriend's parents over his own mother, I began to see patterns that had been invisible to me when viewed individually. These weren't isolated incidents of poor planning or unfortunate timing. They were symptoms of a deeper problem that I had been enabling for decades. I found myself reaching for the cardboard box I kept in the hall closet, the one filled with cards and letters from my children over the years. Birthday cards with generic messages, Mother's Day notes with dutiful sentiments, Christmas cards that arrived later each year and contained less personal content with each passing holiday season. As I spread them across my kitchen table, chronologically from the most recent backward, I began to notice something that made my chest tighten with recognition. The evolution of their affection was written in increasingly distant language. The early cards from when they were young adults establishing their own lives contained genuine warmth and specific references to shared memories. "Thanks for always believing in me, Mom. Remember when you drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I had the flu sophomore year? I know I don't say it enough, but you're the best mother anyone could ask for." But as the years progressed, the messages became more generic, more obligatory. "Happy birthday to a wonderful mother. Hope your day is special. With love on Mother's Day." Recent cards contained nothing more than their signatures, as if signing their names was effort enough to fulfill whatever minimal obligation they felt toward acknowledging my existence in their lives. The phone rang while I was reading a particularly impersonal card from last year's Mother's Day, one that Susan had clearly grabbed from a drugstore rack without reading beyond the front cover sentiment. I recognized Robert's number on the caller ID and felt my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of hope and dread. "Hi, Mom, how are you feeling today?" His voice carried that careful tone people use when they're testing the emotional temperature of a situation they'd rather avoid discussing directly. "I'm fine, Robert. How is Jennifer feeling? I hope her food poisoning has resolved." There was a pause that lasted a beat too long, and I could almost hear him scrambling to remember the details of yesterday's excuse. "Oh, she's much better. It was probably just a 24-hour thing. You know how those go." "I'm glad to hear it. And how are Emma and Grace? I hope they didn't catch whatever Jennifer had." Another pause, longer this time. "They're fine too. Actually, they never really felt sick at all. Turned out Jennifer was the only one affected." I closed my eyes and felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard certainty. Yesterday, he'd claimed the girls were worried they might be getting sick and needed to stay home as a precaution. Today, they'd apparently never felt unwell at all. The lie was so casual, so automatic, that I realized Robert had stopped considering whether his excuses needed to be consistent or believable. He'd grown so accustomed to my acceptance of whatever explanation he offered that he'd stopped putting effort into making those explanations credible. "Well, I'm relieved everyone is healthy," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I was worried about all of you. Listen, Mom, about yesterday. I know you went to a lot of trouble preparing dinner, and I feel terrible that we couldn't make it. Maybe we could reschedule for this weekend? Jennifer was saying she'd love to see you soon." The casual offer to reschedule, as if my Christmas dinner was equivalent to a lunch date that could be moved around based on convenience, revealed everything I needed to know about how Robert viewed my time and effort. 3 days of preparation, a lifetime of Christmas traditions, the emotional weight of gathering family during the most meaningful holiday of the year. All of it was something that could be rescheduled for a more convenient time when they had nothing better to do. "That's thoughtful of you to offer, Robert, but I think I'm going to be busy this weekend. I have some important appointments I need to keep." "Appointments? Is everything okay? Are you having health problems?" The concern in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old impulse to reassure him, to minimize any worry I might be causing, to prioritize his comfort over my own truth. But that impulse died as quickly as it had surfaced, replaced by something harder and more honest. "I'm meeting with my attorney to make some changes to my will. After yesterday, I've realized there are some things I need to update." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway 3 rooms away. When Robert finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, taking on the sharp edge of someone whose financial interests had suddenly been threatened. "Changes to your will? Mom, you're not thinking clearly right now. You're upset about Christmas, and I understand that, but making major legal decisions when you're emotional isn't a good idea. Why don't we talk about this in person? I could come over tonight and we could discuss whatever is bothering you." The speed with which his concern had shifted from my health to my legal documents told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. He wasn't worried about my well-being, he was worried about his inheritance, the same inheritance he'd been taking for granted while simultaneously taking me for granted. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, Robert. And I've already made my decision. I'm leaving everything to charity." The explosion of protest that followed was exactly what I had expected, but hearing it still felt like being slapped. "You can't be serious! Mom, we're your children. That money belongs in the family. You can't just throw away everything Dad worked for because we missed one dinner. Your father worked for that money so he could take care of me and provide security for our family. He's been gone for 28 years, Robert. I'm the one who's been taking care of everything since then, and I'm the one who gets to decide what happens to it. But Mom, be reasonable. We have mortgages, college tuitions, retirement planning. We've been counting on that inheritance as part of our financial future. You can't just pull the rug out from under us because you're angry about one misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding hit me like a physical blow. 24 hours ago, I had sat alone at a table set for 12, surrounded by food I'd spent days preparing, abandoned by children who couldn't be bothered to show up or even call to check on me afterward. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was a revelation. "You've been counting on my money as part of your financial future, but you haven't been counting me as part of your emotional present. You've been planning for my death while ignoring my life. Well, Robert, I'm still alive, and I'm still capable of making decisions about my own property. Mom, please. Let's not say things we'll regret. I love you, you know that. We all love you. Yesterday was just bad timing, bad luck. It won't happen again." "You're right about one thing, Robert. It won't happen again. Because I won't be planning any more family gatherings for people who don't consider me worth their time to attend." I hung up the phone before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt like liberation. Within 10 minutes, my phone was ringing again. Susan's number this time, which meant Robert had immediately called his sister to strategize about what they were now apparently thinking of as a crisis that required management. "Mom, Robert just called me and said you're talking about changing your will. Please tell me he misunderstood what you said." Susan's voice carried the same sharp edge of financial panic that had characterized Robert's call, but it was wrapped in a veneer of daughterly concern that might have been convincing if I hadn't just spent the morning reading through years of increasingly impersonal cards and remembering decades of increasingly thoughtless behavior. He understood perfectly, Susan. I'm leaving everything to charity because I've realized that my children view me as a bank account with a pulse, rather than a mother who deserves their respect and consideration. That's not fair, Mom. We've had this conversation before about how busy our lives are, how hard it is to balance everything. We love you, but we can't drop everything every time you want to get together. We have responsibilities. And apparently I'm not one of them. You know that's not what I meant. Look, about yesterday, I'm sorry we couldn't make it to Christmas dinner. Dorothy really did have a fall, and we felt obligated to check on her. But maybe we could have handled it differently. Maybe Michael could have gone alone while Tyler and I came to your house. The apology was so carefully constructed, so precisely calibrated to acknowledge fault without accepting full responsibility, that I realized Susan had probably been rehearsing it since Robert's call. She was sorry they couldn't make it, as if external forces had prevented their attendance rather than their own choices. She felt obligated to help Michael's mother, implying that obligation to his family superseded any obligation to her own. And she suggested that, maybe, they could have handled it differently, offering the smallest possible concession while maintaining that their decision had been fundamentally reasonable. Susan, Dorothy has 3 other children who live within 30 minutes of her retirement community. She has round-the-clock medical staff and a facility management team specifically trained to handle elderly residents who have falls. What she didn't have was a daughter who had spent 3 days cooking Christmas dinner for a family that couldn't be bothered to show up. Mom, you're being dramatic. It was one dinner. One day. We can make it up to you. How, Susan? How exactly do you plan to make up 30 years of treating me like I'm optional? How do you make up for teaching your son that his grandmother's feelings don't matter as much as his convenience? How do you make up for showing me that everything else in your life is more important than maintaining a relationship with the woman who raised you? The silence that followed was different from Robert's shocked pause. This was the silence of someone who had been forced to confront truths she'd been avoiding, and who didn't like what she was seeing when she looked honestly at her own behavior. I never meant for you to feel unimportant, Mom. If that's how our actions have affected you, then I'm sorry. But cutting us out of your will seems like a nuclear option. Can't we work on rebuilding our relationship instead of ending it? I'm not ending our relationship, Susan. I'm ending my financial relationship with people who have demonstrated that money is the only reason they're interested in maintaining a connection with me. If you want to rebuild our emotional relationship, we can certainly try. But you'll be doing it because you value me as a person, not because you're hoping to inherit my house. It's not about the money, Mom. It's about family legacy. About keeping Dad's memory alive. About maintaining the connections he would have wanted us to preserve. Your father's memory doesn't live in his bank account, Susan. It lives in the values he tried to teach you. Values like showing up for people who matter to you, like keeping your word when you make commitments, like treating your mother with respect and consideration, rather than taking her for granted year after year. After I hung up on Susan, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence of my children's declining affection, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. I felt proud of myself. Proud for finally speaking the truth instead of swallowing it to keep peace. Proud for demanding the respect I deserved instead of begging for scraps of attention. Proud for recognizing my own worth even when the people I'd raised had forgotten it entirely. The third call came from David an hour later, and his approach was different from his siblings. Where Robert had been demanding and Susan had been manipulative, David's voice carried genuine distress. Mom, Robert and Susan called me about your conversation this morning. I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Is this really about missing Christmas dinner, or is this about something bigger? The question surprised me with its directness, and for the first time since yesterday's abandonment, I felt a flicker of hope that at least one of my children might be capable of genuine self-reflection. It's about 30 years of missing Christmas dinners, David. Missing birthday celebrations, missing Mother's Day visits, missing phone calls, missing any indication that I matter to any of you beyond my usefulness as a source of financial security. But Mom, we've been going through a lot lately. The economy, work stress, relationship pressures. It's not that we don't care about you. It's that we're barely keeping our heads above water with our own responsibilities. David, you're 45 years old. For how many more years do you plan to use the excuse that life is hard? Do you think my life has been easy? Do you think raising 3 children alone after your father died was simple? Do you think managing on a secretary's salary while putting all of you through college was stress-free? I know you sacrificed for us, Mom, we all know that. But we can't live our entire adult lives trying to repay you for doing what parents are supposed to do. At some point, we have to focus on our own families, our own futures. The casual dismissal of my sacrifices as simply what parents are supposed to do revealed an attitude that explained everything about how my children had learned to treat me. In their minds, I had been obligated to give them everything while they were obligated to give me nothing in return. My love, my support, my financial assistance, my endless availability, all of that was just the basic requirement of motherhood. But their time, their attention, their consideration, those were precious resources that needed to be carefully allocated to more important priorities. You're absolutely right, David. Parents are supposed to sacrifice for their children. But children are also supposed to grow into adults who appreciate that sacrifice and who demonstrate that appreciation through their actions. Apparently, I failed to teach you that lesson when you were young, but it's not too late for you to learn it now. What do you mean? I mean that you're going to discover what it feels like to be truly independent from your mother's support system. No more emergency loans when money gets tight. No more insurance policies with you as beneficiaries. No more safety net to fall back on when your own financial planning proves inadequate. You wanted to focus on your own families and your own futures? Congratulations! Now you get to do exactly that. Mom, please don't do this. I know yesterday was wrong, and I know we should have handled things differently. But we can fix this. We can do better. Yesterday wasn't wrong, David. Yesterday was revealing. It showed me who my children really are when they think their inheritance is secure and their mother's feelings are irrelevant. Well, now your inheritance isn't secure, and you're going to find out whether your interest in maintaining a relationship with me was genuine or purely financial. How can you say that? How can you question whether we love you? Because love isn't a feeling, David. Love is a choice that you make every day through your actions. And for years, your actions have been choosing everything else over me. Your girlfriend's parents over your own mother. Your convenience over my expectations. Your comfort over my feelings. You've been choosing all right, just not me. The phone calls continued throughout the day. Robert called back twice, Susan called 3 more times, and David sent a text message saying he was driving over to discuss this in person. I turned off my phone and spent the afternoon writing letters to the charities that would soon be receiving substantial donations in my children's names. The American Cancer Society, because Frank had died of lung cancer, and I wanted his memory honored through research that might spare other families the grief we'd endured. The local food bank, because I'd volunteered there for 15 years and had seen firsthand how even small donations could transform lives. The scholarship fund at the community college, because education had been my escape from poverty and I wanted to provide that opportunity for young people whose families couldn't afford to send them to school. As I wrote each letter explaining that I would be leaving my estate to their organizations, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for years. My money would go to people who needed it rather than people who expected it. My legacy would support causes I believed in rather than children who had stopped believing in me. The doorbell rang at 4:30, and I opened it to find David standing on my porch with the kind of expression people wear when they're about to have the most important conversation of their lives. His face was red from the cold, but his eyes held an intensity I hadn't seen since he was a teenager grappling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "Can I come in, Mom? I think we need to talk." I stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he looked around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, its lights twinkling cheerfully, despite the fact that no gifts had been exchanged beneath it. The carefully arranged decorations that had taken me hours to place now seemed like evidence of my own pathetic hope that this year would be different. "I've been thinking about what you said on the phone," David began, settling into Frank's old recliner with a familiarity that reminded me how much time he'd spent in this house as a child, "about love being a choice that you make through your actions. And I realized that if I'm honest about my actions over the past few years, I haven't been choosing you very often." The admission surprised me, both in its directness and in its apparent sincerity. Of my 3 children, David had always been the most emotionally intelligent, the most capable of genuine introspection. But it had been years since I'd seen evidence of that capacity, and I'd begun to wonder if the sensitive child I remembered had been permanently buried under the pressures of adult life. "I keep trying to remember the last time I called you just because I wanted to talk to you, not because I needed something or had some obligation to fulfill." "I can't remember, Mom." "Isn't that terrible?" "I can't remember the last time I treated you like someone I enjoyed spending time with, rather than someone I had to check in with occasionally to avoid feeling guilty." He leaned forward in the chair, his hands clasped tightly together in a gesture that reminded me of Frank when he was wrestling with difficult decisions. "Amanda's parents invited us to dinner yesterday, and my first thought wasn't about disappointing you. It was about relief that I had an excuse to avoid the family gathering. When did spending time with my own mother become something I looked for excuses to avoid?" The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself appreciating both his honesty and his willingness to examine his own behavior without immediately making excuses for it. This was the kind of conversation I'd been hoping to have with my children for years, even though it was happening under circumstances I'd never imagined. "I think it happened gradually," I said carefully. "I think it became easier to take me for granted because I made it easy. I never demanded respect, never set boundaries, never insisted that your relationship with me should be reciprocal rather than one-sided. I trained you to treat me as optional, and you learned that lesson perfectly. But that doesn't make it right. And it doesn't excuse the fact that I stopped seeing you as a real person with real feelings. Somewhere along the way, you became just Mom in my mind. Not Margaret, not an individual with her own needs and desires and disappointments. Just this eternal mother figure who would always be there no matter how badly I treated her." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that had been falling steadily since morning. "I think I stopped seeing you as someone who could be hurt, because you never showed us when we hurt you. You just absorbed it, and kept loving us and kept taking care of us as if nothing had happened. I thought that's what good mothers did. I thought unconditional love meant never showing my children the cost of their choices. But I realize now that I was teaching you that your choices didn't have costs, that you could treat people poorly without consequences, that love was something you could take without giving anything back. So what happens now, Mom? If you go through with changing your will, what kind of relationship do we have going forward?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding since making my decision. What did I want my relationship with my children to look like if money was no longer part of the equation? What was left of our connection if I removed the financial incentive that had been motivating their attention? I suppose we'll find out who really wants to maintain a relationship with me and who was just going through the motions until I died and they could inherit my house. And what if I want to try to rebuild something real with you? What if I want to learn how to be a better son, starting now? Then you'd have to do it knowing that you won't inherit anything from me. You'd have to do it because you value our relationship for its own sake, not because you're hoping to benefit financially from staying in my good graces." David turned away from the window and looked directly at me, with an expression that reminded me powerfully of the earnest child he'd been before life, taught him to prioritize convenience over connection. "I'd like to try, Mom. I'd like to learn how to love you the way you deserve to be loved. Not because of your will, but because I've realized that I miss having a real relationship with you. I miss feeling like I had a mother who mattered to me as a person, not just as an obligation I had to manage." For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Not tears of grief or anger, but tears of hope. Hope that maybe one of my children could learn to see me clearly, could grow into the kind of person who chose love over convenience, could demonstrate that the values Frank and I had tried to teach them hadn't been completely lost in the transition to adult selfishness. I'd like that too, David. But it would have to be different from what we've had before. It would have to be reciprocal. You couldn't just show up when it was convenient and disappear when other things became more interesting. You'd have to treat me like someone whose time and feelings matter, not like someone who exists solely to serve your needs. I understand. And Mom? I'm sorry. I'm sorry for yesterday. And I'm sorry for all the yesterdays before that, when I chose something else over you. I'm sorry it took the threat of losing your inheritance to make me realize how badly I've been treating you. I'm sorry I became the kind of person who had to be taught through consequences instead of learning through love. The apology was everything I'd been hoping to hear for years, but it was also coming at a time when apologies alone weren't enough. David's words were sincere, his regret was genuine, but words and regret couldn't undo decades of thoughtless behavior. They were a starting point, not an end point. Apologies are important, David, but they're just the beginning. If you really want to rebuild our relationship, you'll have to show me through your actions that you mean what you're saying. And you'll have to do it knowing that my will isn't going to change back, that this isn't a test you can pass to restore your inheritance. I understand. The money is gone, and I accept that. What I don't want to lose is the chance to have a real relationship with my mother for whatever time we have left together. After David left, promising to call me the next day not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to continue our conversation, I sat in my quiet house and felt something shifting inside my chest. Not forgiveness. That would take time and proof that his intentions were sincere, but possibility. The possibility that even profound damage could be repaired if someone was willing to do the difficult work of rebuilding trust. The possibility that love, when it came with consequences, could teach lessons that love without boundaries never could. The possibility that my decision to change my will wasn't just about punishing my children for their selfishness, but about giving them the opportunity to discover who they really were when money was no longer part of our relationship. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the phone call I would make to Robert Henderson in the morning, confirming my decision to leave everything to charity. I thought about the conversations I would need to have with my other two children, conversations that would determine whether they were capable of the kind of growth David seemed to be contemplating. Most of all, I thought about Frank, and about what he would think of the choices I was making. I believed he would be proud of me for finally demanding the respect I deserved. I believed he would understand that love without accountability wasn't really love at all. And I believed he would approve of ensuring that our life's work would benefit people who understood the value of generosity, rather than children who had learned to take generosity for granted. The decision was made, and there would be no going back. Tomorrow would bring the legal formalities that would transform my midnight revelation into binding reality. But tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep feeling like I had reclaimed something precious that I'd lost without even realizing it was gone. I had reclaimed my own worth. And that was an inheritance no one could take away from me. The law office of Henderson and Associates occupied a restored brick building on Main Street that had once housed Willowbrook's first bank. The irony wasn't lost on me as I climbed the stone steps on the morning of December 27th, carrying with me the decision that would redistribute wealth in ways my children had never imagined possible. Robert Henderson met me in his reception area personally, his usual professional demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine concern for my emotional state. Maggie, I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this decision? Once we execute these documents, reversing them will be legally complex and emotionally devastating for your family. I settled into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, the same chair where Frank and I had signed our original wills 30 years ago, when our children were teenagers, and our greatest worry was ensuring they'd be provided for if something happened to us. How naive we'd been to think that providing for them financially was the same thing as preparing them to be decent human beings. I'm more certain than I've ever been about anything, Robert. My children have spent decades showing me who they really are. It's time I showed them who I really am. Robert opened the thick folder containing the documents his staff had prepared overnight, his expression reflecting the careful neutrality of a lawyer who'd learned not to judge his client's family decisions. I've drafted everything according to your specifications. The Willowbrook Community Foundation will receive 60% of your estate to establish the Margaret and Frank Johnson Charitable Fund. The American Cancer Society gets 20%. The remaining 20% is split between the local food bank, the Community College Scholarship Fund, and the Children's Hospital. As he read through the specifics, I felt a deep satisfaction settling in my chest. My money would go to organizations that helped people who couldn't help themselves, rather than to adult children who'd simply chosen not to help themselves to basic human decency. Frank's life insurance, my teacher's pension, the house we'd bought and paid for through decades of careful saving, all of it would serve people who understood that assistance was a gift to be appreciated, rather than an entitlement to be expected. There's one more thing I want to add, Robert. I want each of my children to receive a letter explaining my decision, to be delivered along with copies of the new will. I want them to understand exactly why their mother chose strangers over her own family. Are you sure that's wise, Maggie? Sometimes it's better to let legal documents speak for themselves rather than risk inflammatory language that might complicate future relationships. There won't be any future relationships to complicate if they can't accept my decision. And if they can't accept it, then they deserve to understand the reasoning behind it. I spent the next hour writing 3 letters, each one tailored to the specific failures of each child, each one a final attempt to teach lessons they should have learned decades ago. The letters weren't cruel, but they were unflinchingly honest about behaviors I'd excused for too long, and expectations I'd abandoned for the sake of peace. To Robert, I wrote about his casual dishonesty and his assumption that his mother's time and effort were infinitely disposable. To Susan, I detailed her manipulation tactics and her talent for making others responsible for her obligations. To David, I acknowledged his apparent willingness to change, while explaining that willingness couldn't undo decades of neglect. After signing the documents that would transform my children's financial futures, I walked home through Willowbrook's quiet streets, feeling lighter than I had in years. The December air was sharp and clean, and the Christmas decorations in shop windows that had seemed mockingly cheerful just days ago now looked like celebrations of possibility. My future was my own again, my choices were my own again, and my money would serve my values, rather than enabling my children's lack of values. The confrontation I'd been expecting began before I even reached my front door. Robert's silver Mercedes was parked in my driveway, and through my living room window I could see him pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Susan's SUV was parked across the street, and she was sitting in the driver's seat talking rapidly on her phone with the kind of animated gestures that suggested she was coordinating some kind of strategy. I let myself into my house and hung up my coat with deliberate slowness, giving myself time to prepare for whatever assault they'd planned. I'd barely settled into my kitchen with a cup of tea when the doorbell rang, followed immediately by insistent knocking that suggested my children had abandoned any pretense of respectful behavior. I opened the door to find all 3 of them standing on my porch with expressions ranging from Robert's barely contained fury to Susan's calculated distress to David's obvious discomfort with whatever ambush his siblings had orchestrated. Behind them stood Michael, Susan's husband, whose presence suggested they'd decided this situation required legal representation. "We need to talk, Mom," Robert announced, pushing past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. "All of us. Right now." They filed into my living room and arranged themselves with the kind of strategic positioning people use when they're preparing for battle rather than conversation. Robert and Susan claimed the couch, presenting a united front, while Michael stood behind them with his arms crossed. David took the chair farthest from the group, his body language suggesting he was here under protest. "We know what you did this morning," Susan began, her voice carrying the kind of controlled emotion she'd perfected during her years as a corporate manager. "Michael spoke to Robert Henderson's assistant, and we know you signed papers changing your will. We're here to give you one last chance to reconsider before this situation becomes irreparable." The casual admission that they'd been checking up on my legal activities revealed everything I needed to know about how they viewed my right to privacy and autonomy. In their minds, decisions about my money were family decisions that required their input and approval. The fact that I'd acted independently, without consulting them or considering their financial needs, was apparently an act of rebellion that needed to be corrected. "There's nothing to reconsider," I said calmly, settling into Frank's old recliner and feeling his presence like armor around me. "I've made my decision, and it's final." "Mom, be reasonable," Robert said, leaning forward with the kind of aggressive posture he probably used in business negotiations. "You're talking about giving away everything Dad worked for to complete strangers. Organizations that don't know you, don't care about you, will probably waste most of the money on administrative costs. Meanwhile, your own children, the people Dad actually wanted to provide for, get nothing. Your father wanted to provide for you when you were children who needed providing for. You're adults now, with careers and homes and families of your own. What you need now isn't money, it's character. And that's something I apparently failed to give you when it might have made a difference." Susan's carefully controlled facade cracked slightly, revealing the calculating anger underneath. "This is about Christmas dinner, isn't it? You're destroying our family's financial future because we couldn't attend one meal? That's insane, Mom. That's not proportional to what actually happened. What actually happened was the culmination of 30 years of you treating me like I don't matter. Christmas dinner was just the moment when I finally stopped making excuses for your behavior and started seeing it clearly." Michael stepped forward, his lawyer's training evident in his attempt to frame the conversation in legal rather than emotional terms. "Margaret, I have to tell you that from a legal standpoint, this decision could be challenged. If your children can demonstrate that you were under emotional duress, or that your judgment was impaired by grief or depression, a court might overturn the will." The threat was delivered with professional politeness, but it was still a threat. They were already planning to fight my decision in court, already strategizing ways to prove I was incompetent or mentally unstable, already treating my autonomous choice as evidence of psychological breakdown rather than moral clarity. "Are you threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent, Michael? Because I made a decision you don't like about my own money." "I'm just explaining the legal realities, Margaret. When elderly people make dramatic changes to estate planning after emotional trauma, courts sometimes intervene to protect both the individual and the family's legitimate interests. The only legitimate interest here is my right to dispose of my property as I see fit. And the only emotional trauma was discovering that my children view me as a means to an end, rather than a person deserving of basic respect." Robert's composure finally snapped completely. "Respect? You want to talk about respect? We've been respectful. We've been patient with your demands, your expectations, your constant need for attention. We've included you in our lives even when it was inconvenient, even when we had other priorities. And this is how you repay us?" The accusation that I had been demanding attention, rather than simply hoping for consideration, revealed how completely Robert had rewritten the narrative of our relationship in his own mind. In his version of events, I was the needy, attention-seeking mother who imposed on her busy adult children's time. They were the patient, long-suffering children who graciously tolerated my unreasonable expectations. "Robert, name one demand I've made on your time in the past 5 years. One specific instance where I insisted you do something for me rather than asking politely and accepting whatever excuse you offered when you declined." The challenge hung in the air while Robert struggled to come up with examples that would support his claim. The truth was that I'd trained myself not to make demands precisely because I'd learned that demands led to conflict, and conflict led to even less contact with my children. "You didn't have to make demands," Susan interjected when it became clear Robert couldn't answer my question. "The expectations were always there. The guilt trips when we couldn't make it to family events, the disappointed sighs when we had to change plans, the way you made us feel bad for having lives of our own." "I see. So expressing disappointment when people break commitments to me is emotional manipulation. Having feelings about being excluded from family gatherings is a guilt trip. Hoping that my children might prioritize me occasionally is preventing them from having lives of their own. That's not what I meant, and you know it." "I know exactly what you meant, Susan. You meant that I should have been grateful for whatever scraps of attention you chose to give me, and I should have kept my mouth shut about wanting more. You meant that mothers exist to serve their children's needs, but children have no obligation to consider their mother's needs." David, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up from his corner chair. "Can I say something? As the only person in this room who's actually apologized for how we've been treating Mom?" His siblings turned to stare at him with expressions of betrayal, as if he'd violated some unspoken agreement to present a united front against my unreasonable behavior. "David, don't," Susan warned. "She's manipulating all of us right now. Don't let her turn you against your own family." "She's not turning me against anyone. I'm finally admitting that we've been taking her for granted for years." Christmas dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most obvious example of a pattern we've all been participating in. "So you're taking her side?" Robert demanded. "You think it's reasonable for her to disinherit her own children because we missed one family gathering?" "I think it's reasonable for her to decide that people who don't act like family don't deserve to be treated like family." "And honestly, Robert, when was the last time you talked to Mom about anything other than her health or your own problems? When was the last time you asked about her interests, her concerns, her feelings about anything?" The question forced Robert to confront something he'd been avoiding, and his inability to answer it spoke louder than any denial could have. None of my children had shown interest in me, as a person, in years. I existed in their minds as a maternal function, rather than an individual with my own thoughts and emotions and experiences. "This is exactly what she wants," Susan said desperately. "She wants to divide us against each other, make us feel guilty, manipulate us into competing for her approval. Can't you see what she's doing?" "What I see is a woman who spent 72 years putting everyone else's needs before her own, and who finally decided to put her own values first for once. What I see is someone who taught us to be kind and generous and considerate, and who's holding us accountable for forgetting those lessons." Michael cleared his throat, trying to regain control of a conversation that was spiraling away from the unified pressure campaign they'd apparently planned. "Perhaps we could discuss a compromise. Margaret, what if the children committed to more regular contact, more family gatherings, more consideration for your feelings? Could you consider modifying the will to reflect their improved behavior?" The suggestion that my love could be purchased through performative attention revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood what had happened. They thought this was a negotiation, a business transaction where they could trade minimal behavioral improvements for continued access to my money. "Michael, you can't negotiate your way back into an inheritance by promising to treat me better. The will isn't a punishment that can be lifted through good behavior. It's a recognition of reality. My children have shown me who they are, and I've responded accordingly." "But people can change, Mom," David said quietly. "I know I need to change. I know I've been a terrible son, and I want to do better. Doesn't that count for anything?" His question broke my heart because I could hear the genuine regret in his voice, but it also strengthened my resolve, because change motivated by financial loss wasn't the same thing as change motivated by genuine love. "David, if you want to rebuild our relationship, I'm open to that possibility, but you'll be doing it as someone who isn't inheriting anything from me, which means your motivation will have to be genuine rather than strategic." "That's not fair," Susan exploded. "You're punishing all of us for past behavior that we can't undo. You're holding grudges instead of giving us the chance to make things right." "I'm not holding grudges, Susan. I'm accepting reality. For 30 years, you've had the chance to make things right, and you chose not to take it. You chose convenience over consideration, your own priorities over family obligations, your own comfort over my feelings. Now I'm choosing to direct my resources toward people who might actually appreciate them." Robert stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. "Fine. If that's your final decision, then we'll fight it. We'll hire attorneys. We'll challenge your mental competence. We'll prove that you were manipulated into making these changes." Michael's right. Courts don't like it when elderly people make radical changes to their wills after emotional trauma. Go ahead and try, Robert. Spend your own money on legal fees trying to prove that I'm mentally incompetent, because I finally got tired of being treated badly. Hire experts to testify that making decisions based on how people treat you is evidence of psychological breakdown. Put your mother through the humiliation of a public competency hearing, because you can't accept that actions have consequences. The threat to drag me through court proceedings designed to prove I was mentally unfit hit exactly the way I'd intended it to. Robert's willingness to publicly humiliate me in pursuit of his inheritance would demonstrate to the entire community exactly the kind of person he'd become. "We don't want to fight you, Mom," Susan said, trying a different approach. "We want to work this out as a family. But you have to meet us halfway. You have to be willing to consider that maybe we're not as terrible as you think we are." "Susan, I don't think you're terrible people. I think you're people who've learned terrible habits because no one ever held you accountable for them. But it's too late for me to fix that now. You're adults, and you'll have to fix it yourselves." The visit ended with threats and ultimatums and promises to fight my decision through every legal avenue available. Robert and Susan left together, already planning their strategy for proving I was incompetent or unstable. Michael followed them out after leaving his business card and a warning that I should reconsider my position before things became unnecessarily adversarial. David lingered after the others had gone, his face reflecting the emotional exhaustion of someone who'd been forced to choose between his siblings and his conscience. "I'm sorry about that, Mom. I knew they were angry, but I didn't realize they were planning to ambush you like that." "It's not your fault, David, but I hope you understand now why I made the decision I did. Your brother just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent because I won't give him my money. Your sister thinks I should be grateful for whatever minimal attention she chooses to give me. These aren't people who love me. They're people who love what I can provide for them. I know, and I know my apologies don't undo years of taking you for granted. But I want you to know that I meant what I said yesterday. I want to try to rebuild something real with you, even knowing that there's no inheritance involved. I hope you mean that, David. Because if you're sincere, then maybe I didn't completely fail as a mother after all." Over the following weeks, the battle lines became even more clearly drawn. Robert hired a probate attorney specializing in will contests, a man whose reputation for aggressive tactics preceded him into every courtroom in the county. Susan began a social media campaign designed to portray me as a confused elderly woman who'd been taken advantage of by unscrupulous charity representatives. The court filings arrived on a snowy January morning, officially challenging my mental competence and requesting an immediate freeze on my assets pending a full psychological evaluation. The legal language was cold and clinical, describing me as an elderly individual who may be suffering from cognitive decline exacerbated by social isolation and grief-related depression. Reading those words, seeing my own children's signatures on documents designed to strip me of my legal autonomy, crystallized something that had been building since Christmas Day. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, respect, and the fundamental question of whether I had the right to make decisions about my own life that my children disapproved of. But they had underestimated their mother in ways that would soon become apparent. 72 years of living had taught me a few things about fighting for what I believed in, and 30 years of teaching teenagers had given me skills they'd never bothered to notice. The war they wanted was about to begin in earnest, and they were going to discover that the woman they'd dismissed as a lonely old lady was actually a force to be reckoned with. The courthouse in downtown Willowbrook had seen its share of family disputes over the years, but few cases had generated as much local interest as Johnson versus Johnson. By February 15th, the date set for my competency hearing, the entire town seemed to have chosen sides in what the local newspaper had dubbed the Christmas will battle. I arrived that morning wearing my navy blue suit and Frank's pearl pin, carrying myself with the dignity of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the court-appointed psychiatrist, had spent 3 hours with me the previous week conducting what she described as a comprehensive cognitive assessment. I'd answered her questions about current events, solved her mathematical puzzles, recited poetry I'd memorized in college, and demonstrated a memory for details that impressed even her professional objectivity. When she'd asked about my decision to change my will, I'd explained my reasoning with the same clarity I'd once used to teach Shakespeare to skeptical teenagers. "Mrs. Johnson," she'd said at the end of our session, "I want you to know that in 30 years of practice, I've rarely encountered someone your age with such sharp cognitive function and clear reasoning ability. Your children's attorneys are going to have a very difficult time proving incompetence." The courtroom was packed with familiar faces when I entered with my attorney, Elena Rodriguez, a formidable woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law and had a reputation for decimating opponents who underestimated elderly clients. Pastor Williams sat in the first row behind me, along with Betty Morrison from next door, Tom Fletcher from the library board, and at least a dozen other community members who'd known me for decades. Robert and Susan sat across the aisle with their legal team, their faces wearing the grim expressions of people who'd invested too much money and pride in a battle they were beginning to suspect they might lose. Michael looked particularly uncomfortable, probably realizing that his involvement in this case wouldn't reflect well on his own legal practice if word spread about his willingness to attack his mother-in-law's mental competence. David entered just as the proceedings were about to begin, surprising everyone by walking to my side of the courtroom and taking a seat directly behind me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, including his siblings, who stared at him with expressions of profound betrayal. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s who'd been handling family court cases for over 20 years, called the session to order, with an expression that suggested she'd already formed some preliminary opinions about the case before her. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to determine whether Mrs. Margaret Johnson possesses the mental capacity to make decisions about her estate planning. The burden of proof lies with the petitioners to demonstrate that she lacks such capacity. Counselor Mitchell, you may present your opening statement. Robert's attorney James Mitchell stood with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than evidence. His opening statement painted a picture of a lonely, grief-stricken elderly woman who'd been manipulated by professional fundraisers into making decisions that contradicted a lifetime of family devotion. Your Honor, Margaret Johnson is a 72-year-old widow living alone, increasingly isolated from her family due to the natural difficulties of aging. The evidence will show that her decision to disinherit her 3 children was made during a period of emotional instability following what she perceived as abandonment on Christmas Day. This wasn't a rational business decision made by someone thinking clearly about her legacy. This was an emotional reaction by someone whose judgment had been compromised by depression and social isolation. Mitchell's strategy was predictable but potentially effective. He was betting that the court would see an elderly woman lashing out in hurt and confusion, rather than a competent adult, making principled decisions based on clear-eyed assessment of her children's character. Elena's response was swift and devastating in its precision. Your Honor, the evidence will demonstrate that Mrs. Johnson made her decision after decades of careful observation of her children's behavior, not in a moment of emotional instability, but in a moment of unprecedented clarity. We will show that her cognitive function is exceptional for someone of any age, her reasoning is sound, and her decision reflects values she's held consistently throughout her adult life. The real question here isn't whether Mrs. Johnson is competent to make decisions about her estate, it's whether her adult children are willing to accept that those decisions have consequences. The first witness Mitchell called was Dr. Bernard Thompson, a psychiatrist who specialized in age-related cognitive decline and who had never actually examined me. His testimony was a masterclass in professional speculation, disguised as expert opinion. Based on my review of the case materials, it's concerning to see such a dramatic change in estate planning following what appears to have been a triggering emotional event. In my experience, elderly individuals living alone are particularly susceptible to depression and anxiety, which can significantly impact judgment and decision-making capacity. Elena's cross-examination revealed the fundamental weakness in his testimony. Dr. Thompson, you've never met Mrs. Johnson, correct? That's correct, but I've reviewed the relevant documents and case history. You haven't administered any cognitive tests to her personally? No, but the pattern of behavior described in the court filings is consistent with… Dr. Thompson, isn't it true that you've built your entire career on testifying in will contests, primarily for families seeking to overturn estate decisions they don't like? The objection from Mitchell was sustained, but the damage was done. Elena had established that their expert witness was essentially a hired gun whose opinion was purchased rather than based on actual examination. The parade of character witnesses Mitchell called to testify about my supposedly declining mental state backfired spectacularly. Susan took the stand to describe my, quote, increasing forgetfulness and social withdrawal, only to be confronted with Elena's documentation of every community event I'd attended, every volunteer commitment I'd fulfilled, and every bill I'd paid precisely on time over the past 2 years. Mrs. Miller, you testified that your mother seemed confused and forgetful during family conversations. Can you give us a specific example of this confusion? Susan shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. Well, she would sometimes repeat stories she'd already told us, or forget details about things we'd discussed before. Isn't it possible that your mother repeated stories because you weren't listening the first time she told them? Isn't it possible that she forgot details of your conversations because those conversations were brief and largely one-sided? I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Miller, when was the last time you called your mother just to ask about her day, without needing something from her or fulfilling some obligation? The silence that followed lasted long enough for everyone in the courtroom to understand that Susan couldn't answer the question, because the answer was never. Robert's testimony was even more damaging to his case. Under Elena's questioning, he admitted that he couldn't remember the last book I'd read, couldn't name a single volunteer organization I belonged to, and had no idea how I spent my time when I wasn't serving his family's needs. Mr. Johnson, you're asking this court to declare your mother mentally incompetent, but your own testimony suggests you know almost nothing about her mental activities, her interests, or her daily life. How can you assess her competence when you've demonstrated such ignorance about who she actually is as a person? She's my mother. I know her. You know her function in your life, Mr. Johnson, but do you know her as an individual with her own thoughts, feelings, and preferences, independent of her role as your mother? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Robert's inability to answer it revealed everything the court needed to know about the relationship dynamics that had led to this hearing. When Elena called Dr. Walsh to the stand, the case effectively ended. Her testimony about my cognitive assessment was thorough and unequivocal. Mrs. Johnson scored in the 95th percentile on every test I administered. Her memory is exceptional, her reasoning ability is sharp, and her emotional stability is remarkable for someone who's endured the kind of family conflict that brought her to my office. I found no evidence of depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, or any other condition that would impair her decision-making capacity. Dr. Walsh, in your professional opinion, is Mrs. Johnson competent to make decisions about her estate planning? Absolutely. More than competent. She's one of the most mentally acute individuals I've examined in years of practice. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. David took the stand as a witness for my defense, his face pale but determined as he swore to tell the truth about our family's dynamics. My siblings want this court to believe that our mother is confused or unstable, but the truth is that she sees our family more clearly than any of us do. We've spent decades treating her like she exists solely to serve our needs, and when she finally said enough, we decided she must be crazy rather than accepting that we've been terrible children. Mitchell's objection was overruled, and David continued with the kind of brutal honesty that had been missing from our family for years. I missed her Christmas dinner because I prioritized my girlfriend's parents over my own mother. My brother lied about his wife being sick rather than admit he simply didn't want to come. My sister abandoned her own mother to help her husband's mother, who has 3 other children living nearby. We didn't miss dinner because of emergencies or obligations. We missed it because we've learned to take our mother for granted. David's voice grew stronger as he continued. The competency hearing isn't about protecting our mother from making bad decisions. It's about protecting our inheritances from the consequences of our own bad behavior. She's not mentally incompetent. We're morally incompetent. The cross-examination by Mitchell was brief and ineffective. David had admitted the truth so completely that there was nothing left to attack except his decision to finally tell it. Elena's closing argument was delivered with the passion of someone defending not just a client, but a principal. Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental question about autonomy and respect for elderly individuals. Mrs. Johnson's children want this court to declare her incompetent not because she lacks the mental capacity to make decisions, but because they don't like the decisions she's made. They want to substitute their judgment for hers, their values for hers, their priorities for hers. She gestured toward me as I sat at the defense table, feeling every eye in the courtroom focused on my face. The evidence is overwhelming that Mrs. Johnson possesses exceptional mental capacity. She's chosen to leave her estate to organizations that reflect her values of service and generosity, rather than to children who've demonstrated neither service nor generosity toward her. That may be a decision that disappoints her family, but it's not a decision that requires court intervention. Judge Harrison's decision was swift and unequivocal. After reviewing all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds that Mrs. Margaret Johnson possesses full mental capacity and competence to make decisions regarding her estate planning. The petition to declare her incompetent is denied. Furthermore, this court finds the petition to be without merit and awards attorney fees to the defendant. The courtroom erupted in applause from my supporters, while Robert and Susan sat in stunned silence as they processed not only their legal defeat, but the additional financial burden of paying my legal costs. The judge's decision to award attorney fees was a rare rebuke that signaled her opinion of their frivolous challenge. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local newspaper and regional television stations waited to capture the aftermath of what had become Willowbrook's most talked-about legal battle. I stood on the courthouse steps with Elena and David, fielding questions with the confidence of someone who'd been vindicated completely. Mrs. Johnson, how do you feel about the court's decision? I feel grateful that our legal system protects the rights of elderly individuals to make their own decisions, even when their families disagree with those decisions. What would you say to your other children who challenged your competence? I would say that they've learned an expensive lesson about the difference between love and entitlement. Love doesn't come with guaranteed inheritance, and disrespect doesn't come without consequences. Do you regret changing your will? I regret that it took me 72 years to understand that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling. I regret that I raised children who thought they could treat me poorly without consequences. But I don't regret finally demanding the respect I should have insisted on decades ago. The aftermath of the court decision rippled through Willowbrook in ways I hadn't anticipated. The local newspaper published a series of articles about elder abuse and family dynamics that used my case as a starting point for broader discussions about how adult children treat aging parents. Letters to the editor ran heavily in my favor, with many people sharing their own stories of being taken for granted by family members who assumed their love was inexhaustible. The Willowbrook Community Foundation received inquiries from several other elderly residents who wanted to establish charitable funds rather than leave their estates to ungrateful heirs. Pastor Williams incorporated themes from my situation into several sermons about family responsibility and the importance of honoring parents through actions rather than just words. But the most significant changes occurred within my own family. Robert and Susan, faced with legal defeat and mounting attorney fees, seemed to realize that their strategy of challenging my competence had backfired dramatically. Not only had they failed to restore their inheritance, they'd publicly demonstrated exactly the kind of character flaws that had led to my decision in the first place. Robert's first attempt at reconciliation came through a letter delivered 3 weeks after the court decision. The envelope was addressed in his careful business handwriting, and the letter inside was clearly the product of considerable thought and multiple drafts. "Dear Mom," it began, "I want to apologize for the way I've handled this situation. The court case was a mistake, and I should never have questioned your mental competence simply because I disagreed with your decision. I've spent the past few weeks thinking about what David said during his testimony, and I'm beginning to understand that he was right about a lot of things." The letter went on to acknowledge specific instances of taking me for granted, specific moments when he'd prioritized his own convenience over my feelings, specific examples of the behavior that had led to my decision to change my will. It was the kind of detailed, honest self-reflection that I'd been hoping to see from him for years. "I know I can't undo the damage I've done to our relationship," the letter concluded, "and I know that apologizing now, after losing in court, makes my motives suspect. But I want you to know that I'm sorry not because I lost my inheritance, but because I lost sight of the fact that you're a person who deserves to be treated with respect and consideration. If you're willing to try to rebuild our relationship, I'd like to learn how to be a better son, even if it's too late to change your will." Susan's approach was different but equally surprising. She appeared at my door one evening in early March, alone for the first time since the court battle began. Her usual polished appearance was replaced by something more authentic: jeans and a sweater, minimal makeup, the kind of casual presentation that suggested she'd come to have a real conversation rather than to manage my perceptions. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said as I invited her into my living room. What I did was inexcusable. I tried to have my own mother declared mentally incompetent because I was angry about losing money. I can't imagine what Dad would think of the person I've become. She settled into the same chair where David had sat during his first visit after Christmas, and for the first time in years I saw traces of the thoughtful child she'd been before ambition and social climbing had hardened her into someone I barely recognized. "I've been seeing a therapist since the court case," she continued, "trying to understand how I became someone who could treat her own mother the way I've been treating you. I think I got so focused on maintaining appearances, on projecting success and control, that I lost track of what actually matters." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had since she was a teenager. Susan talked about the pressure she felt to live up to impossible standards, about her fear that any display of vulnerability would be seen as weakness, about how she'd learned to manipulate situations to maintain the illusion of perfect competence. She acknowledged that she'd treated me as an extension of her own image rather than as an individual with my own needs and feelings. "I know I can't undo 30 years of selfishness with one conversation," she said as she prepared to leave. "But I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your daughter, even if it's too late to inherit from you." David's efforts to rebuild our relationship continued throughout the spring, with a consistency that gradually convinced me of his sincerity. He called every Sunday evening, not with agenda items or obligations to fulfill, but simply to talk about our respective weeks. He remembered details from previous conversations, asked follow-up questions about my volunteer activities, shared stories about his work that went beyond surface-level updates. More importantly, he began including me in his life in ways that felt genuine rather than obligatory. When Amanda's lease was up and they started looking for a place to live together, he asked for my opinion about neighborhoods and apartment features. When he was struggling with a difficult situation at work, he sought my advice and actually seemed to value my perspective. "I'm starting to remember what I liked about talking to you when I was a kid," he told me one Sunday evening in April. "You always listened like what I was saying actually mattered to you. I forgot that somewhere along the way, and I'm sorry it took losing your inheritance to remind me." The most profound change, though, was in how I viewed myself and my relationships with others. The court case had forced me to articulate my own worth, to defend my right to make decisions based on my values rather than other people's expectations. The process of standing up for myself had revealed strength I'd forgotten I possessed, and dignity I'd been giving away too freely for too long. My volunteer work took on new meaning, as I found myself gravitating toward organizations that helped other elderly people who'd been marginalized or taken advantage of by their families. The Willowbrook Senior Center asked me to facilitate a support group for grandparents dealing with difficult adult children, and I discovered that my experience had given me insights that could help others in similar situations. The charitable fund that would eventually bear Frank's name and mine began taking shape as the foundation's staff worked with me to identify specific programs and initiatives that reflected our shared values. Scholarships for first-generation college students, emergency assistance for elderly residents facing financial hardship, support for community programs that brought generations together. All of it felt like a more meaningful legacy than simply enriching children who'd already demonstrated they didn't need enriching. By late spring, I had established new patterns and relationships that felt more authentic than anything I'd experienced in years. The friends who'd supported me during the court case had become closer, drawn together by the shared recognition that standing up for principles sometimes required standing alone. The community members who'd witnessed my transformation from accommodating mother to empowered individual began seeking my perspective on their own family challenges. Most surprisingly, I found myself feeling genuinely happy for the first time since Frank's death. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince herself that everything was fine, but the deep satisfaction of someone living according to her own values rather than someone else's expectations. The legal victory had been important, but the personal victory was transformative. I had reclaimed my right to be treated with respect, established that my feelings and preferences mattered, and demonstrated that consequences for poor behavior could be meaningful and permanent. The woman who had sat alone at Christmas dinner, questioning her own worth and making excuses for her children's cruelty, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that love required reciprocity, that generosity demanded appreciation, and that being a good mother sometimes meant refusing to enable bad behavior. The transformation was complete, and there would be no going back to the woman I'd been before I learned that I deserved better than what my children had been giving me. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my yellow Victorian house, preparing Christmas dinner for the family I had chosen, rather than the family I had been assigned by blood. The December sun streamed through windows that no longer felt like barriers between me and a world that had learned to value what I offered, and the familiar sense of roasting turkey and cinnamon-spiced apple pie filled rooms that echoed with laughter instead of loneliness. David arrived first, as had become his custom, bringing Amanda and her parents, who had become unexpected friends over the months of genuine relationship building that followed our legal victory. Behind them came Pastor Williams and his wife Helen, Betty Morrison from next door, and Dr. Walsh, who had become not just my advocate but my friend after witnessing my transformation from defensive defendant to confident community leader. The dining room table was set for 12 again, but this time every place setting represented someone who had chosen to be here, someone who understood that gathering together was a privilege to be honored rather than an obligation to be endured. The good china gleamed under the chandelier that Frank had installed decades ago, but now it served people who appreciated beauty rather than simply expected it. Elena Rodriguez settled into the chair beside mine, her presence a reminder of how standing up for myself had connected me with other strong women who refused to accept less than they deserved. We had become unlikely friends, bonding over our shared understanding that respect wasn't something you asked for politely, but something you demanded firmly and maintained consistently. "You look different than you did a year ago," Elena observed as we watched the gathering crowd with the satisfaction of people who had fought hard battles and emerged victorious. "Not just happier, but stronger. Like you finally remember who you really are." She was right. The woman who had spent 30 years shrinking herself to accommodate other people's comfort had been replaced by someone who understood that taking up space was a right rather than an imposition. The endless apologizing for my needs, the constant minimizing of my feelings, the reflexive acceptance of whatever treatment others chose to give me, all of that had disappeared along with my willingness to enable ungrateful children. The doorbell rang as we were preparing to sit down for dinner, and I opened it to find Robert standing on my porch, holding a small wrapped package. His appearance had changed over the year of rebuilding our relationship, the entitled arrogance replaced by something that looked like humility earned through genuine self-reflection. "I know you said no gifts," he began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had learned not to assume his presence was automatically welcome. "But I wanted to give you something that represents what I've learned this year." Inside the package was a framed photograph from my 65th birthday 7 years ago, showing Frank and me cutting the cake I had made while my children and grandchildren looked on. But Robert had written something on the back of the bureau frame that took my breath away. "To the woman who loved us enough to teach us that actions have consequences. Thank you for not giving up on the possibility that we could become better people." The acknowledgement meant more than any apology could have, because it demonstrated understanding rather than just regret. Robert had finally grasped that my decision to change my will hadn't been punishment but education. Not revenge, but recognition that real love required accountability. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" I asked, noting how carefully he avoided assuming an invitation that hadn't been extended. "Only if there's room," he replied, and I heard in those words the recognition that space at my table was something to be earned rather than claimed. Susan's journey toward redemption had been more complex, complicated by years of manipulation and image management that had become so automatic she'd forgotten how to be genuine. But she had persevered through months of therapy and painful self-examination, slowly learning to value authenticity over appearance and connection over control. She arrived an hour into dinner, apologizing for her lateness, but not making excuses that would shift responsibility away from her own poor time management. The Susan who would have expected the entire gathering to accommodate her schedule had been replaced by someone who understood that other people's time mattered as much as her own. "I brought something for the community center," she said, handing me an envelope. "I know you're always raising money for their programs, and I thought this might be more meaningful than trying to buy my way back into your good graces with personal gifts." The check inside was substantial enough to fund their after-school program for an entire semester, and it represented something far more valuable than money. Susan had learned to channel her resources toward causes I cared about rather than expecting me to be grateful for whatever attention she chose to give me. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing the dynamics around my table with the analytical eye of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine affection and performed obligation. Every conversation felt real. Every laugh felt authentic. Every moment of connection felt chosen rather than forced. David had brought photo albums from his childhood, pictures that told the story of our family, before money and inheritance expectations had complicated our relationships. We spent an hour looking through images of birthday parties and school plays and family vacations, remembering the foundation of love that had existed before entitlement had poisoned it. "Do you remember this one?" David asked, pointing to a picture of himself at age 12, standing beside me at my teacher appreciation ceremony. I was so proud that day, telling everyone that my mom was the best teacher in the whole school. I forgot somewhere along the way that you were still that same amazing person, just older and deserving of the respect I used to give you automatically. The evening's most meaningful moment came when Tyler, Susan's son, stood up to make a toast with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been planning his words carefully. "I want to say something to my grandmother," he began, his young voice carrying across the dining room with surprising authority. "I know I was just a kid during most of the stuff that happened, but I'm old enough now to understand what my family did to you. We took you for granted, and when you finally said you'd had enough, instead of apologizing and doing better, we tried to prove you were crazy." He paused, looking around the table at faces that reflected everything from pride to regret to admiration for his courage in speaking truth that adults had struggled to acknowledge. "But you weren't crazy. You were brave. And watching you stand up for yourself taught me something important about not letting people treat you badly just because they're family. I want to be the kind of person who deserves to be in your life, not because I'm related to you, but because I add something good to it." The spontaneous applause that followed Tyler's toast felt like validation not just of my choices, but of the possibility that the next generation could learn from their parents' mistakes. This young man had witnessed the consequences of taking love for granted and had decided to choose differently. As the evening wound down and guests began the gradual process of departure, I found myself reflecting on the year of transformation that had brought me to this moment. The Christmas dinner that had started as abandonment and become revelation. The legal battle that had forced me to defend my right to make my own decisions. The slow rebuilding of relationships based on mutual respect rather than blood obligation. The Margaret and Frank Johnson Charitable Fund had awarded its first scholarships in September, sending 5 local students to college with support that would continue throughout their academic careers. The Emergency Assistance Program had helped dozens of elderly residents manage unexpected expenses that might otherwise have forced them from their homes. The intergenerational programs had brought together young and old in ways that benefited both. My money was serving my values in ways that enriching ungrateful children never could have. The legacy Frank and I were creating together, even after his death, reflected the principles we had tried to live by, rather than simply rewarding people who shared our DNA. The support group I facilitated at the Senior Center had grown from 6 participants to over 20, as word spread that there was a place where elderly people could discuss difficult family relationships without judgment or pressure to maintain peace at the expense of self-respect. Many of the members had made their own decisions about inheritance and boundaries, inspired by seeing that it was possible to demand better treatment without sacrificing your identity as a loving person. Betty Morrison lingered after the other guests had departed, helping me clear dishes with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had become family through choice rather than accident. "You know what I love most about these dinners?" she said as we wrapped leftovers that would feed me for days and remind me of an evening filled with genuine connection. "Everyone here actually wants to be here. Nobody's checking their phone or watching the clock or making excuses to leave early. They're present because they value what you've created." She was right. The table that had once hosted children who attended out of obligation now welcomed people who came out of affection. The conversations that had once been stilted and superficial now flowed with the ease of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As I prepared for bed that night, I walked through my house and saw it differently than I had just a year ago. The photos on my mantle still showed decades of family memories, but now they coexisted with pictures from community events, volunteer recognition ceremonies, and gatherings with friends who had chosen me as much as I had chosen them. Frank's recliner still sat in its familiar spot, but now it was occupied regularly by visitors who came to share stories and seek advice rather than to fulfill minimal obligations to an aging parent. The dining room that had echoed with my solitary Christmas dinner now hosted monthly gatherings of people who understood that shared meals were celebrations of connection rather than endurance tests of family tolerance. The yellow Victorian house that had felt like a mausoleum of unappreciated love had become a center of authentic community, a place where people gathered because they wanted to be together, rather than because duty demanded their presence. In my bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept Frank's journal, now filled with my own observations about the year of changes that had transformed not just my legal arrangements, but my understanding of what family actually meant. The final entry, written just that morning, captured everything I had learned about love and respect, and the courage required to demand both. Frank, I had written, I think you would be proud of the woman I've become since you've been gone. Not because I stopped loving our children, but because I finally learned to love myself enough to insist that love be reciprocal. The money we save together is serving people who understand its value, and the children we raise together are learning that character matters more than inheritance. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as I settled into sleep, marking the anniversary of the decision that had changed everything. 1 year ago, I had been a lonely widow, wondering if decades of devoted motherhood had been wasted on children who saw me as disposable. Tonight, I was a woman surrounded by chosen family, serving my community through meaningful work, and living according to values that honored both Frank's memory and my own worth. The inheritance my children had lost was far less valuable than the self-respect I had gained. The money they would never receive was far less significant than the lessons they had finally learned about treating people well while you have the chance. And the legacy I was creating through conscious choice was far more meaningful than anything I could have left to people who had never learned to appreciate what they already had. The woman who had sat alone at Christmas dinner 1 year ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that family is what happens when people choose to love each other well, and that the greatest gift you can give yourself is the recognition that you deserve to be chosen every single day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.